Europe's Crossroads, Beyond the Pandemic.
So I'm delighted that Danuta Hübner, who's a member of the European Parliament, will be joining us digitally, and I'd like to invite up Irena Tanieli. So if I look like I can't see, it's because I can't. Irena Tanieli, thank you so much for joining us. Many of you will not just as an MEP. Irena, come and sit here. Yes, just here, please. Thank you very much. And where's Guntram Wolf? You there, Guntram? There you are. Who's the director of Bruegel? Come and sit down. Thanks so much. Irena, I'm going to start with you, if I might. I'm going to bring Danuta in. Good morning, Danuta. I'm going to come to you in a moment. Thank you so much for joining us. But I'm going to start, Irena, with you, which is, there's been, I suppose, a fundamental question around Europe in response to the pandemic. And it's about whether countries retreat into a more nationalist politics, or in fact, given the economic recovery plans, given the vaccine program, people respond to this and, if you like, choose more Europe, a period of greater integration. And given climate and the economic challenges, I guess we'd be really interested to hear which direction you think it's going before we get into the detail.
Well, I think everybody now can really acknowledge the big step forward that the European Union has made. I remember very well at the beginning of the pandemic, the kind of debate that we had, and many observers were actually betting that the European Union would break in the face of the COVID crisis. Because we already saw at the very beginning some forces that were closing, some countries that were trying to protect their own borders and not, for example, medical devices not even flowing among member states in the Union. We saw things that, made us think, oh my God, this is not going to work. But then we had this strong reaction which went exactly in the opposite direction, working together, both on the sanitary emergency, helping all the medical devices flowing, investing in research for the vaccine, and in the common purchase of vaccines, which was very controversial at the beginning, and everybody was criticizing. And then it worked so well that now the European Union is the continent with the highest rate of vaccination. So I think that, and then it came, of course, the next generation EU, the common debt that we made to make the economies recover fast. And now we are seeing most of the member states' economies already recovering at a very fast pace. And in 22, all of them, I think more or less all of them, will be back at the pre-crisis GDP level. So I think that Europe has made a big step forward. Of course, this is my perspective. It cannot be seen as one step and then we stop there.
Mm-hmm. Let me stop there, because I'd like to hear from you a little in a moment about your role as Chair of Economic and Monetary Affairs and some of the things that you're thinking in detailed policy terms. But I'd like to put to Guntram and also to Danuta the same sort of fundamental question. Danuta Hübner, as an MEP, do you think that Irena's judgment is right, that we are at a crossroads for Europe, and what we're going to see as a result of the pandemic when we look back is a period of much greater integration in our politics, in our economic management, in the provision of social and public services?
Well, yes and no. I would say what Irena has said is certainly the main component of how we see Europe today and what Europe does and how we managed to move forward during the pandemic, which as we know, is not yet gone. But what we have to remember is that Europe is also divided. We continue to go on two tracks. We continue to have this kind of, I don't want to use the word fight, but this choice between the Europe that is run at European level largely through something that we used to call in the past the community method. We have also this second track, which is trying to coordinate national policies, where I don't think we are always very successful on this. So I think think this kind of dilemma between which Europe is a Europe of people's dreams is just still with us, and there are people politicians as well, who would like to see really more Europe, and not just run by coordination of national policies, which very often do not take into account the common European interests, and rather the others would go different ways. So because of that, we didn't manage actually during these first years of pandemic also to complete reforms, which are really legacy of many years of discussions, and it is unfinished business. And we discuss it with Irene very often, and in the econ, and not only especially the unfinished changes to the EMU architecture, but also, first of all, the banking union. For basically 10 years, we lacked this third important pillar of this part of European landscape. That's extremely important, I think. And also, if you look at what we are doing with the capital market union, I'm saying singular market consciously, where we have made a lot of commitments, we have working plans, but we are moving extremely slowly, and we need a lot of investment, I think, in the years to come. So yes, I think we spare no efforts to do a lot of things, but we as parliamentarians, we are also unhappy sometimes with the scope and also speed of the reforms that we would like to see. We would like to see that we move faster. But we sort of offered ourselves a lot of excellent instruments to cope with the need of further investing in Europe's future. And I'm sure colleagues will discuss the new generation EU. And
Danuta, thank you. Danuta, sorry, I'm just going to interrupt you for a second, because I'd like to come back to those big questions about banking union, capital markets union, but I wanted to bring Guntram, if I might, for a moment. Guntram, it was funny, when I was thinking about this session, I was thinking to myself, actually, about the surprisingly different experience the US and, if you like, the European Union has had, the extent to which the states within the United States have really pulled apart. It certainly seems from a distance. And actually, looking at the European Union, you might well make the argument this has been a moment where Europe could have pulled that direction, but much more came together. And I wonder, from your point of view, from Bruegel's point of view, whether or not you do think we're in for a decade of structural change on the back of this.
Well, I would say really the key to the successful response and the successful period that Europe had during this pandemic was the fact that European countries and the European institutions really worked together. And I think really the European institutions stepped up to the plate and delivered in this period. I mean, first of all, the ECB. It was clear the ECB's response was absolutely crucial in stabilizing the situation. The second really important decision was, of course, on Next Generation EU, so the EU Recovery Fund, which immediately instilled confidence into markets and instilled confidence into the government's abilities to react. And the third big thing has been the vaccination success, which initially, and I have to say I was among the critics, and initially looked not so successful. It was a little bit slow at the beginning, but eventually Europe really delivered on the vaccines. And I have to say, much in contrast to the United States and to even the UK, the EU kept its markets open to vaccines. So the EU exported massive amounts of vaccines, delivered vaccines to the rest of the world, and thereby helped stabilize the economic situation. Now the question is what comes next, and Irene already pointed to it. Well, we would love to see sort of a permanent Next Generation EU or something of that sort. I heard you say something in that direction. And there I think really the question is what's the politics gonna do? And I think if you look at the politics of this, it's very clear that Next Generation EU, so the Recovery Fund, was possible in a situation of a major health crisis combined with an economic crisis. The legal basis was very clearly linked to a very sort of natural disaster issue. So I think both on the politics as well as on the sort of legal basis, it's going to be very difficult to just say, let's continue Next Generation EU. I think we have to treat this as a one-off, but if the one-off turns out to be successful, people will remember, right? And if there's another big crisis in 10 years, people will remember that 10 years ago, we managed to pull through this pandemic together, and we managed to do so successfully. And then it will still be a tough political fight, but at least you have this good past example on which people will refer to, and I think which will then shape the debate and allow us to actually have a joint response again in 10 years. So in that sense, it's not a permanent fiscal union or whatever you want to call it. It's not that, but it is a successful episode of collectively addressing this pandemic and actually succeeding in this pandemic.
So can I ask you then, the three of you, and I'm going to start with you, Irena, to do something very silly, given how foolish it is to try and predict the future, as we've all learned. I'm going to ask you nonetheless to try and give us a sense of what happens between here and 2025. And the reason for that is it seems to me as though there are these two really big pressures coming out post-pandemic. One is inequality and the realizations of how you deal with not just inequality revealed, but inequality inflamed, a broader gap. And the second is inflation, right, and the cost of living issue that I touched upon with Anna. And so I just wondered, if you like, with your hat on as the chair of the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee in the Parliament, what you think is on the to-do list and what is achievable between now and 2025?
Oh my God, this is
It's a big question, but I think for all of us in the audience, it's very hard sometimes to interpret the European institutions, so it'd be helpful to get a sense of kind of what those priorities are.
Yeah, okay. First of all, just to clarify, when I say that we need to keep moving forward, I do not refer simply at, making just next generation EU structural. It's not just about that. I mean, it's about keeping and learning the lesson of what can be achieved when the European institutions work in a cooperative manner, coordinated manner, at all levels and also with the member states. And these, we should remember these on healthcare, on social policies, on green transition, on digitalization, on everything, not just, on banking industry, on capital markets. We've been, you mentioned in the previous panel, the capital markets union, the banking union. I hope that the lesson that we've learned in this past year and a half is that only if we really are capable of creating a European single market, a European capital markets, we will be able to address better the challenges that we have ahead. And the challenges that we have in the next, 3 to 4 years are, first of all, making sure that what we are observing now in terms of GDP rebound is not just a rebound, but it's a growth that we can keep going in the upcoming years, so it can be sustained in the long term and can be sustainable in terms of not only green aspect, but social aspects, inequalities. You mentioned inequalities. Okay, this is a big challenge. We need to think about that. We already were observing divergence and inequality raising before the pandemic. And if we are not careful in monitoring, they will be growing even more in our recovery, because we are investing a lot in things like greater digitalization, innovation. Even the green transition can increase inequalities if we don't follow that carefully with social policies that allow people that are displaced from the old economy being put aside and being again put into the cycle of the new.
But Irena, can I just press you, because I suppose I would really love to come away with a sense of, all right, here are the priorities of what the EU institutions think is real, and we've all read about Next Gen EU. What do you think will actually happen? What of that agenda will actually be delivered?
Okay, first, of course, I see from my own observatory, because in the monetary policy and banking and capital markets, this transition can only be accompanied and done in the right way if we can align public investments, monetary and fiscal policy, monetary policies, and private investments. This is something we need to keep in mind. We can't think that one of the three alone can address it. And that's why I insisted on we need to move forward in creating a single market for capital, for banking sector, but also the instruments and the framework at the European level to keep sustaining investments in these things in the future, but also to keep in mind that there are certain social infrastructure that will need to be in the equation. In the past, we often consider certain kind of social infrastructure only as expenditure, and in some countries we've kept cutting on that. I think about healthcare, and we paid the price in the past year and a half. And I think in terms of training, upskilling, reskilling, we need to start thinking that there are some aspects of social investments that are really needed investment, that are in infrastructure that it will need, and make a distinction between what is productive in terms of addressing these challenges and what is not productive. But we need to accompany the transition with this kind of social infrastructure.
Guntram, I'm going to come to Danuta in a moment, but Guntram, will you follow up on that? And particularly, given the audience and our subject, I can't tell you how many times I've been in conversations where we've talked about banking union, capital markets union, and the issues that in their absence, Europe falls behind US investment in business. Are we on the cusp of something about to happen, or are we on the cusp of a continuing conversation?
Well, I mean, look, I actually wanted to react to two points. I mean, I think the first point on the capital markets and on the banking union is really that I think the nut is very hard to crack, and it's been with us for quite some time. And I think we basically know what needs to be done, but so intellectually I think it's understood. But it takes a major step on many different dimensions that I don't see currently governments ready to do. So I don't think we will really move to the next phase of banking union in the next 2-3 years. But I'm happy to be surprised. Now the other point I wanted to react to is really. On Irene, your sort of interplay of the macro policies in the next years. And there I think what we will see really is a couple of very tough years ahead of us for the public sector. And why is it going to be so tough? I mean, it's basically going to be tough because fiscal consolidation will start in the next years. And that's never an easy moment. When you start tightening the belts, it's actually tough. It's tough for the political system, and this toughness is going to happen, and it's going to force countries, it's going to force governments to make choices between different spending items. And historically, whenever big fiscal consolidations happened, what typically governments tend to do is they tend to cut investments. They tend to cut public investments. They tend to cut the money for the future generations, and they preserve whatever is out there for the current voters, basically. And that's a problem, going back to the climate topic. It's a big problem because we need to invest public and private resources, but we need to invest public resources really in the greening of our economy. Where are those public resources going to come from in a period of fiscal consolidation? This is a major challenge, and that's why I've been advocating in a paper to EU finance ministers what we call a green fiscal pact, so something of a green golden rule or something of that sort that allows to at least maintain green investments to be funded with deficits, to, in a sense, preserve that future-oriented part of government spending, because otherwise the political system is short-term at the end of the day. The political system will prioritize, the current pensioners over the future generation. And I think that's why this next few years will actually be very tough for the political system, because it is the background of fiscal consolidation that is happening. Monetary policy is going to tighten one way or another. We will see this. Inflation is coming, and official line is it's probably going to go away again next year. But I think many people sort of doubt this official line. And so it's going to be on the macro front more difficult to do all of that.
Guntram, just this idea of the Green Fiscal Pact, I think is really interesting, not least given the conversations we've already had about can Europe provide a taxonomy? Can we have long-term guidance that define future markets? One of the big concerns about Europe is there's not long-term financing. What's the politics of the Green Fiscal Pact? Do you have a sense that there is an appetite to adopt it?
Well, I mean, I actually do think there's a serious discussion on this. I mean, there's a big discussion now on the EU fiscal rules, and I basically think the one point that probably will be agreed on is something on the greening. All the rest, it seems to me, is much more difficult to implement. But on the greening, there's a general consensus we need to do this. There's a consensus that this is a major EU priority. We cannot afford to fail on that priority. And so I sense there's political appetite to actually do something so as to exempt green public investment from the fiscal rules, at least for the next couple of years.
Interesting, okay. Guntram, thank you. Danuta, the question I put to Irena to you, where are we going in the next 5 years in detail?
Yes, just first of all, let me say that I fully agree with what Irena started and Gunther continued on this, is that everything is connected so strongly to everything else that this holistic approach, I think, is a must for the years to come. So we have to see all the elements of the whole puzzle. But I think 25 is, of course, just tomorrow, if you think of also how fast we are in decision making. But I think the two issues that you mentioned, one is inflation and the other one inequalities. I think on inflation, it's extremely important to see that we are actually spending months, practically half a year, not being able to agree whether it is a temporary phenomenon, those inflation spikes that we clearly see, or whether this is really a beginning of something much more permanent and more dangerous. And my feeling is that the expectations, which are inflationary expectations, which are largely formed or shaped by the central banks, that this can come to an end rather soon. But the second thing, which we just had yesterday meeting, because I'm in Washington, with IMF also, and we see that we don't dedicate enough time to understand what's going on in labor markets. I think we are still ahead of major structural changes in those markets, and the risk also with productivity, which is not at all growing fast enough to absorb the potential increase of cost. So inflation, I think, is a big uncertainty and big unknown, and it's difficult today to see how it can influence also a lot of aspects of our macroeconomic policies and also the expectations and many other things. So this is very important. And I think the second thing that you mentioned is this inequality. It's true that it is something to be addressed, but not only through sort of social policy. I think we have to realize that in the years to come, 85% at least probably of growth will be happening outside the European Union. And it is smart on our side, I think, to connect ourselves to those sources of external growth. And that's why the international relations and looking anew at our trade policy, which we have done over the last months, this is something which is fundamental, because I think we have to also understand as citizens that globalization is not just a threat, it's also a way of lifting a lot of people from the poverty. But today, even more important is also to use the globalization and to use also European participation in international cooperation to reduce inequalities also in Europe. So I would say that you must not underestimate the importance of our international links, because it's China and Russia there to stay, but we have also the US as a kind of recovered or friend or partner across the Atlantic, which, as you know, we suffered for years of very dysfunctional relations. So there's a lot of things to do together, and this animation of the global events recently, it's not only Glasgow, but also G20 and WTO, and we are having a lot of things to do also externally in the framework of the open strategic autonomy, which is another challenge to avoid that it leads us toward protectionist measures.
Danuta, thank you very much. Irene, I know you want to respond, and also I have a quick question for you. So you respond, then I'm going to ask you a final question.
No, very, very quickly. Obviously, I completely agree with Danuta that we need to take into consideration also the impact and the effects on citizens and society. And in this past year and a half, one of the reasons why we managed also to pursue the right policies and have achieving, for example, such a high degree of vaccination, to impose rule and lockdowns, is also because our measures to support workers in a very hard time were capable of limiting social unrest and problems. And this allowed us to do the right policies in the right climate, with citizens following us and say, okay, they are taking care of us, we follow the rules, and we do everything we can to come out of this crisis all together. So, but this we have to take into consideration. For example, and we did it also at the European level, the SURE program, which actually preceded the Next Generation. The first attempt we did was the SURE, the fund to support employment schemes in the member states. So we didn't see the surge in unemployment and poverty that we could have seen if we didn't have intervened at the social level. So, but we have to be very careful in the upcoming years, as Gunther was saying, if we start to tighten too fast, and that's something we mentioned in our report on the review of macroeconomic governance in the Parliament last July. They say, of course, we will need to go back to some sort of rules and fiscal consolidation, but be very, very careful how we do that. Be gradual enough not to kill the growth that we are spurring, and trying to transition towards a system that allows for certain types of investment to still take place, and I add, to take into consideration the social impact of the transitional phase we are going through.
So this was my final question for you, because I'm struck by what Danuta said about structural changes in the labour market.
Yes.
And I'm struck too by what Guntram just said, which is when I hear people talk about the official line, I often think they themselves don't believe it. And I know that the official line is that inflation will rise and then fall away again. And I know you and the committee have taken a long look at this. And I just wanted a sense, Irina, of whether you believe it, whether you actually think that inflation is going to rise and then fall away again, or you think that there is something that is a more structural shift going on.
Wow, that's a difficult one. We've in the committee we've done tons of hearings. Danuta knows, and I also attended the informal ECOFINs where we debated a lot, of course, and I meet regularly with the ECB, etc. So there is a broad consensus on this. It's not just the official line, but there is a real consensus from all the experts and economists. And the reason is that of course, right now what we see, the surge is related to mostly temporary factors, like the fact that we have bottlenecks in supply chains, or that we have backlogs of demand that was frozen during the COVID and now is recovering but will stabilize over the time. And there are two main things that I think needs to be watched out, because in the past, in the history, were the main drivers for inflationary shocks, which are wages, for instance, but we don't see so far in the Union, but not just in the Union, also at a broader level, we don't see this kind of shocks, even many collective bargaining contracts, we don't see that kind of increases and shocks. It's pretty stable, so this makes me believe that we will not have that kind of inflationary pressures. And the other one in the past was oil price shocks. And now this is maybe the part of the equation where we have the higher uncertainty. What will happen to energy prices? Of course, energy price is only one dimension of the inflationary pressures that we are seeing and then we will be observing. And this is probably the most uncertainty, because here is where we have the transition, is where we are trying to substitute for new sources of energies. Here is also where we have the biggest uncertainty related to international dimension and negotiations and geopolitics and everything. So, also what I saw in Rome this weekend, I think is encouraging. resuming, especially, compared to what we've seen
last couple of years,
in the last couple of years, honestly, compared to what we saw in the past couple of years, what we saw the last week in Rome for the G20, basically resuming multilateralism, dialogue, cooperation. I think this is the right way to address the challenges that come from energy prices and supply and the transition. Of course, there is still some uncertainty, but for the moment, I tend to agree with the broader consensus and believing that it will be temporary.
Okay, Irena, thank you. I'm aware that lots of people here also have the chance to meet and see each other, so I'm going to draw this to a close so we can get and have a chance to have a cup of coffee. But please, first, I'm going to invite you to thank our guests here, then I'm going to put the question to you and then invite you over to coffee. So first, a thank you to Gunther and Wolf from the Bruegel Institute, to Danuta Hübner, MEP, and Irena Tinali, also an MEP. Thank you all.